What did Mary say that consoles, and at the same time cuts like steel? This question may seem impossible to answer at first glance, but if you've ever come across words that embrace and pierce at the same time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Today, I'll take you on a path that blends consolation and demand, tenderness and rigor, the double meaning of the final message that few have had the courage to explain. Stay with me until the end, because what you'll discover now may surprise you and, perhaps, change the way you understand spiritual vigilance. Prophecy and the call to conversion itself. Imagine a simple phrase spoken in a maternal tone, capable of soothing the heart of those who suffer, while simultaneously placing a firm weight on the shoulders of those who live complacently. These are the words of comfort and steel, expressions that, read only superficially, seem like an invitation. When examined more closely, they reveal demands, tests, and accountability. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt a message that embraces you and then immediately challenges you to act? If so, then you know how the experience is simultaneously unsettling and transformative. If not, prepare yourself, because the seventh message we'll explore has this polarizing effect. It comforts and summons, calms and cuts, promises healing and demands courage. The topic here is delicate and profound. We speak of the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje. The echo these words have in thousands of hearts, and above all, the way the last of them carries a double meaning that few have dared to dissect aloud. I'm not proposing empty theories or sensationalism. I want to offer a reading that respects tradition, acknowledges the stories, and helps you discern, with clarity and serenity, what these words intend to provoke in practical life. Spiritual vigilance, commitment to prayer, examination of conscience, and a transformation that isn't comfortable but is real. Throughout this introduction, you will realize that Mary's messages are neither monotonous nor predictable. They are layered. On the one hand, they offer comfort to the afflicted, to broken families, to weary hearts. On the other hand, when spoken with the same gentleness, they contain a hidden steel, a call to radical change, to reparation, to small daily mortifications that forge character and faith. This combination creates a spiritual movement that is both healing and formative, and it is precisely therein that the prophetic power lies. Words that do not limit themselves to comforting, but that demand an active response. Stay with me until the end of this series, because we will bring stories that humanize this experience. We will point out signs and proofs that accompany these messages, and we will translate the 7th message into concrete practices for today. This is not about imposing a path, but about offering tools of discernment so that each person can verify whether what they heard or felt is aligned with peace, charity, and humility, essential criteria when we speak of Marian prophecies and messages. You will see that not every warning is panic, nor every consolation is passivity. There is a subtle balance that we must learn to recognize, but before we understand what she meant, we need to go back to the origins of these messages. But before we delve into the origins of these messages, I want to make a sincere request, not as a commercial break, but as part of the conversation we're building together. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, an experience you've had, or even a question that's stuck in your heart. Sharing your story helps others recognize themselves in these accounts and brings light to those who need comfort and courage. When you comment, you're not just reacting, you're adding a voice to a community seeking discernment about prophecy, spiritual vigilance, and the messages of Medjugorje. It's this exchange that transforms viewers into brothers and sisters on the journey. And if this video touched you in any way, please leave a like. It's a simple way to show support and signal that this type of content deserves to continue. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of message, allowing us to bring more accounts, more careful analysis, and more practical tools to those who want to listen and prepare. If you truly want to follow this journey of discovery, subscribe to the channel. This helps me plan future videos, including the series where we'll dissect each of the 7 messages word by word, and ensures you don't miss the continuation of this reflection. There's no need to write a dissertation. One line, one feeling, one "I've felt something similar" is enough for me to know we're on the right path. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart, and for being part of this search for truth, solace, and spiritual responsibility. Now back to the beginning. How and when these messages began arriving in Medjugorje, and why this changed so many lives. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and to do so, I invite you to journey with me back to the roots of that initial moment that changed the destiny of a small village and, by extension, touched thousands of hearts around the world. It's not just about a vision or an extraordinary occurrence. It's about how a word, spoken on a hill by someone many recognized as a maternal presence, was able to reorder priorities, awaken consciences, and provoke concrete decisions. When the visionaries began to share their messages, what could have remained private gained public resonance, and the effect was not neutral. There were healings, reconciliations, changes in habits, as well as resistance, theological discussions, and searches for discernment. All of this reveals that the authority of the phenomenon lies not only in the apparitions, but in the transformation that followed. To speak of authority here is to speak of human testimony. The names of those young people who became voices of something greater came to be remembered by those seeking signs of truth. Ordinary people who suddenly found themselves at the center of something that demanded responsibility. This human closeness is fundamental to understanding why the messages were not received merely as fine words, but as invitations to change. Often those who listened felt immediate comfort. At the times, they felt called to make tough decisions, to adjust routines, to make choices that filter intentions and reveal what truly matters. This is not folklore. It is an impact that reaches deep within and spreads throughout community life. There is a productive tension between consolation and rigor that needs to be honestly acknowledged. The message that soothes a wounded heart can, in the same vein, demand a conversion, a renunciation that seems painful, but which in the long run redeems and strengthens. This combination of tenderness and firmness is what makes the appeal at once human and demanding. It is like a mother who caresses and, when necessary, points in the direction that requires courage. This ambivalence is, sorry to repeat the image, consolation and steel, a form of language that is not content with empty comfort, nor with the harshness of those who only pronounce sentences. It is a call that aims for real transformation. When we examine the accounts of those early years, we also perceive a practical dimension that often goes unnoticed. The transformation didn't come as an ever-visible spectacle. It was built in the details of small decisions. Resuming prayer, restoring family relationships, abandoning habits that eroded trust, prioritizing sacramental encounters or moments of silence. These repeated choices generated a process of inner tempering, something like sharpening a blade through the continual use of everyday choices. And it is in this silent work that the power of the messages manifests itself most faithfully, not as an isolated miracle, but as a persistent movement that changes mindsets and behaviors. It's also necessary to look at the human context. Not everyone involved experienced the phenomenon in the same way. Some felt serene joy, others faced misunderstanding, and even those who carried the weight of responsibility for years on end. Some visionaries reported frequent apparitions. Others saw these encounters cease. This human context underscores that the authority of testimony is not a cold institutional construct, but a pulsating narrative of real lives with anguish, doubts, and acts of faith. Understanding this context helps us interpret the messages not as abstract messages, but as invitations extended to imperfect people, which makes the call even more demanding and, paradoxically, closer. From the community's perspective, the messages have had tangible public effects: pilgrimages, renewed community practices, the creation of small prayer groups, and a new sensitivity to concrete charity. This shows that the message's reach goes beyond individual consolation. It transforms cultural and social structures as hearts respond. When many adopt a discipline of prayer or a lifestyle more attentive to others, the consequences are visible. Less individualism and more gestures that sustain life in common. And it is this impact that often seems to confirm for many a practical authenticity that goes beyond mere words. At the same time, remaining alert to pitfalls is essential. Not every account is authentic, nor is every enthusiasm synonymous with depth. Discernment requires clear criteria, verifying whether the messages converge on peace, love, humility, and edifying fruits. Whether they produce conversion and not scandal, whether they point to practices that strengthen spiritual and moral life. This critical and humble stance does not diminish the experience of those who have been touched. On the contrary, it protects the community from sensationalist interpretations and helps preserve what is truly transformative. Thinking about the practical implications is inevitable. When a message calls for vigilance, it's calling for concrete changes, decisions that affect routines, relationships, and priorities. Re-establishing daily prayer, dedicating time to examining one's conscience, prioritizing gestures of reconciliation, and making charitable commitments are examples of responses that aren't dramatic, but are effective. True transformation, in fact, usually occurs in these small, repeated acts, a renewed mindset, slowing down to focus on the essential, choices that condense values into actions. This is how steel is tempered, not by a single blow, but by repetitions that shape character. The story of the early days also reminds us that receiving messages isn't passive. There's always a shift in attitude. Some listen and remain inactive. Others listen and respond with a life-changing response. It's in this dialogue between listening and responding that the depth of a message is measured. And when we see accounts of people who reoriented their priorities and rebuilt relationships, we realize that the phenomenon has a more lasting power than one might initially imagine. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, exploring how exactly the seventh message concentrates in a few lines this tension between consolation and demand, and how its words, when practiced, produce a concrete impact on the personal and community journey. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." The 7 unrevealed messages appear, at first glance, as a coherent set of invitations, words that emerge in moments of silence, and that sound, for many, like an itinerary of return to prayer, return to humility, return to commitment to others. But if we allow ourselves to look closely, we realize that they are not repeated as general advice. Each has a different tone, texture, and emphasis, as if they were stages of the same inner journey. Some bring explicit consolation. They comfort the afflicted, soothe broken hearts, offer hope where there was discouragement. Others, with equal gentleness, call for vigilance, a change of mindset, and the making of decisions that affect how we live our faith in our daily lives. 6 of these messages primarily fulfill this role of support and reorientation. They are paths of transformation that invite, suggest, and inspire small practices that, repeated, produce real impact. 6, a consolation. The 7th is a knife and a cure at the same time, a short line that, as many testimonies confirm, can both embrace and demand a rupture. When we describe these 7 messages in general terms, it's not to scrutinize every detail now, but to demonstrate a pattern. There's a progression from support to challenge, from gentle request to decisive call. In practice, this translates into concrete dynamics in people's lives. Some people find in one of the messages unexpected relief from old traumas. Others, faced with another, feel the weight of choices that need to be reconsidered. There are encounters that generate silence and solace, and others that provoke restlessness and movement. This alternation between reassurance and demand is what gives the messages their originality, and also what makes them so powerful in the process of forming a new spiritual mindset. What happens when a community receives this kind of communication over a prolonged period? A ripple effect emerges. Prayer practices that spread, daily decisions that align with an ethic of service, groups that emerge to share the experience of others. The impact is evident in the way ordinary people reorder priorities, how families choose to reconcile, how young people rediscover meaning and purpose. It is this kind of transformation, discreet but persistent, that is often cited by those who have experienced Medjugorje and then tried to translate the experience into concrete life. At the same time, there is natural resistance, doubts, antagonisms, divergent interpretations that require discernment and clarity. It is not a linear process. It is a journey with twists and turns, constant learning and adjustments. Visualize for a moment each message as a piece of a mosaic. Separately, each piece has its own color and shape. Together, they compose a spiritual landscape that guides decisions and reveals hidden truths about the human heart. Some pieces are clearly welcoming, comfort for those who mourn, simple advice for those who feel lost. Others have sharp edges. They touch areas where routine numbs us, where a complacent mindset resists change. And then comes the seventh piece, small in words but dense in meaning. It is here that many people feel a tug inward, a summons that brooks no half measures. At this crossroads, consolation and exigency meet, and the conversion called for is not merely theoretical. It demands practices, choices, renunciations, and attitudes that demonstrate sincerity. There's also a behind-the-scenes effect that doesn't always appear in reports. The human weight on those who convey the message, the wear and tear of repeated testimonies, the intimate doubts that can arise over time. Not all mystical airs are light. There are shocks, nights of anguish, moments when silence replaces the apparition, leaving a hole to be filled with searching and reflection. This behind-the-scenes aspect makes the entire phenomenon more human and less idealized, demonstrating that revelations don't automatically translate into emotional stability for those at the epicenter of the experience. And paradoxically, it's on this human ground that many of the messages gain credibility, because they aren't fabricated by empty rhetoric, but rather arise from people who face doubts, make decisions, and keep moving forward. From a practical standpoint, the 7 messages serve as a manual of small choices, fasting or abstinence as a discipline that refines the will, persistent prayer that reorders affections, frequent confession that promotes reconciliation, works of charity that transform intention into action, attention to the Eucharist that sustains the community's journey. These are not magic formulas, but strategies of inner temperament that, when repeated, generate change. The mindset that is formed is not the result of a persuasive argument, but of habits that reveal priorities. And when the fabric of daily life begins to respond to these habits, the impact becomes visible. More patience, less impulsive decisions, a more attentive look at the suffering of others. At the same time, it is necessary to maintain a critical and prudent eye. Not every experience that seems spiritual is authentic. Not every enthusiasm equates to depth. Discernment is key here, distinguishing between emotional impulse and consistent calling, between personal experience and edifying fruit. This process of verification is an integral part of the journey and protects both the individual and the community from the temptations of sensationalism. When the evaluation criteria are based on peace, humility, and the fruits of charity, the messages gain a foundation that makes them useful and transformative. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. And in doing so, we'll focus specifically on the seventh message, the passage many describe as capable of consoling the broken and at the same time challenging the complacent. Let's analyze its language, its imagery, and the effects it has when put into practice, how it reconfigures decisions, changes routines, and above all, demands a renewal of mindset that isn't comfortable, but can be liberating. Comment, "This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject." And to do so, we need to examine the language of the messages with a magnifying glass, because it is within them that the power to simultaneously console and demand lies hidden. When a phrase arrives as both an embrace and a blade, it is no coincidence. Each word carries symbolic weight. Each verb points a moral direction, and each image reveals a spiritual pedagogy. Consider, for example, a seemingly simple expression like "walk with me." At first hearing, it sounds like a tender invitation, an outstretched hand. "Come, you are not alone. I accompany you." But read in its deepest layers. The same expression is a test of commitment. "Walk with me" implies rhythm, discipline, renouncing comfortable paths, and above all, a willingness to follow where the voice indicates, as far as required. The double meaning is there, an invitation that welcomes and a test that demands. This is the logic of many Marian phrases, a call that comforts, and at the same time points to decisions that change mentality and behavior. Another recurring image is that of silence or a quiet art. When we say "be silent," it may seem like advice for retreat and inner healing, a safe space where emotions reorganize. But silence can also be a forge. It requires facing shadows, acknowledging wounds, silencing excuses, and taking responsibility. The comfort of retreat becomes a tool for transformation when silence reveals hidden truths that demand action. Thus, the same word functions as medicine and scalpel, cure and diagnosis, and it is up to the listener not to remain merely on the emotional surface, but to allow the revelation to penetrate and produce concrete results in daily life. By dissecting key phrases, we realize that the symbols used in the messages are not vague. Path, light, weapon, metaphorical. Crown, metaphorical. Forgiveness, vigilance. Each of these terms carries a spiritual grammar. Light consoles because it illuminates what was lost. Light also reveals hidden shadows. Forgiveness rebuilds relationships, and at the same time demands renunciation of pride, a decision that changes habits and impacts daily choices. When language calls for vigilance, it doesn't call for panic. It calls for attention to the inner self, to purposes, to the small decisions that together shape character. The hidden truth is not revealed with flourishes. It appears in the clinical practice of choices, how you react to offense, whether you choose reconciliation or revenge, whether you prioritize prayer over distraction. On a practical level, double reading translates into exercises that combine prayer and action. The call to repentance, for example, can motivate a sincere confession that consoles the soul. But this repentance must translate into a change in routine to be real. It's not enough to say, "I repent." It's necessary to review decisions, break habits that fuel error, and introduce practices that support the new direction. This is where transformation ceases to be abstract and becomes routine. Mindsets change not through fleeting emotions, but through repetition, small sacrifices, discipline in prayer, conscious decisions that shape daily life. Those who interpret the message merely as consolation risk remaining comfortable. Those who also accept the harshness embark on a journey of transformation that can be demanding yet liberating. Symbols also have a communal impact. When a message speaks of peace, family prayer, or service, it's not just targeting the individual. It's shaping a cultural shift. The impact is seen in the decisions made by families who change their priorities, by communities who reformulate church gatherings, by groups who embrace charitable works as a concrete expression of faith. Thus, the practical interpretation of the double meaning amplifies the impact. It's not just the heart that must change, it's the social fabric that responds to the small choices that become habits. This correspondence between interior and exterior is what makes the experience transformative and visible. Behind the scenes, however, the tension can be heavy. Those responsible for conveying messages experience pressure that is not only spiritual, but also very human. Public expectation, personal doubts, criticism, and also a moral burden to guide without manipulating. This human reality explains why apparitions and words are followed by debates, requests for discernment, and the need for clarification. Recognizing this human side does not diminish the power of the messages. Rather, it places them in context and reminds us that revelation requires a reflective community, with a critical mindset and a commitment to truth and the common good. When we compare words with life stories, what often emerges is coherence between preaching and practice. Those who accepted the demand, incorporated habits, and made painful decisions witnessed profound changes, less anxiety, more meaning, repaired relationships, and value-driven choices. On the other hand, where the reception was merely emotional, the results were inconsistent. This helps explain why the message that consoles also cuts. Because true healing only occurs when there is a correspondence between feeling and action, between inner comfort and outer courage to change. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and show how, word by word, the seventh message serves as a synthesis of this pedagogy. It embraces the wounded, demands courage from the complacent, and reveals a dynamic of conversion that is this crossroads between consolation and rigor. By analyzing each term, its images, and the practical implications, from the call to vigilance to the concrete decisions that shape the journey, it becomes clear that the impact is not immediate like a spectacle, but progressive, the result of repetition and fidelity to small choices. This reading is not abstract theory. It is a tool for those seeking to authenticate spiritual experiences and translate revelations into life. Comment: this makes sense to me. Once you understand that the words of consolation and strength carry a practical need, it's impossible not to recall real stories of those deeply touched by these messages. There are reports of people who came to Medjugorje or came into contact with the messages in the midst of intense suffering, bereavement, family crises, illness, and felt a peace that seemed impossible at that moment. A woman who lost her son in an accident said that upon reading the phrase, "Do not be afraid, I'm with you," she cried in a different way. It wasn't just grief. It was as if she had received a silent embrace that restored her strength to carry on. This kind of consolation is real, but it is also provocative, because along with the relief comes the call, forgive, reconcile, trust. And she herself said she didn't want to forgive the person responsible for the accident, but felt that the message invited her to a decision of liberation. This is the strength behind the consolation, the part that hurts, but that heals. Another testimony tells of a man who, after years away from faith, felt restless upon hearing about spiritual vigilance. He said he couldn't sleep well, as if something were urging him to look within. Accepting this invitation, he went to confession after decades. He left saying that the weight he carried on his chest had lifted. Understand, it's not just emotion, it's real transformation. This change wouldn't have happened if the message had been merely sweet. It was the demanding part, the blade that cuts through the old, that pushed him to a decision. There are also stories of trial. People who, after embracing the message, faced resistance at home, criticism from friends, and moments of loneliness. It's curious how the message that consoles also divides. It urges people to maintain their faith even when the environment seems hostile. It urges consistency even in the face of misunderstanding. One young woman said she began praying the rosary alone and that her family laughed at her, calling her old-fashioned. But over time, they began to grow closer, asked to pray together, and even began to change the way they treated each other at home. It was a slow process, but the fruit was reconciliation. This is the silent impact that few notice. It's a change that begins in one heart and spreads throughout an entire family. It's important to remember that these accounts are personal experiences, and each person needs to discern carefully, so as not to romanticize or take as a rule what happened in another's life. Not all comfort comes from the same source, nor is every uneasiness a sign of an authentic message. This is why prudence and prayer are so necessary. Still, when we examine these testimonies as a whole, we see patterns, inner peace that cannot be explained solely by psychological suggestion, changes in mindset that lead to more responsible decisions, emotional healing that restores broken relationships. This is social proof that seemingly simple words carry the power to reorient destinies. There are also reports of signs, small or large, that accompany the messages. People who experience meaningful coincidences soon after hearing a phrase that touched them. Families who reconcile unexpectedly, situations that are resolved providentially. It's not about transforming everything into a miracle, but recognizing that often the message doesn't come alone. It is confirmed by events that awaken hope and strengthen the faith of those who were wavering. And even when there are no visible signs, the greatest proof is the change in attitude. Someone who was bitter becomes more serene. Someone who lived with resentment learns to forgive. Someone who was indifferent begins to care for others. It is at this point that we understand that the impact is not merely subjective, it is observable. These stories also reveal something important. Consolation is not an anesthetic that keeps us still, but an impulse that sends us back to life with renewed vigor. It prepares the ground for the steel to fulfill its function, cutting away what needs to be cut. And steel, in turn, is not violence or punishment. It is the polishing instrument that removes the excess, that removes what is hindering the fullness of spiritual life. Therefore, those who experience these things often say it hurts, but that afterwards comes a feeling of relief, of lightness, as if they were finally on the right path. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because after hearing so many stories, the inevitable question is, how do these words resonate with us today in practice? How can we translate comfort and strength into concrete actions, into real steps in our personal and community journey? That's what we'll reflect on next. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the final message isn't enough as an idea. It needs to be translated into practice, into decisions that shape routines and transform mindsets. When I say that the seventh message is comfort and strength, I want to show how this manifests itself in concrete habits you can try today, without it becoming empty ritualism, but as instruments of transformation that tune the heart and test the sincerity of faith. Imagine, for example, a simple practice of daily silence. Set aside 5 minutes in the morning or evening to close your networks. Tune out external noise and remain silent before an intention or a brief word that touched you. This prayer of silence doesn't have to be long or complicated, just a space to notice what moves you, to listen to your concerns, and to let the presence that comforts speak before the day demands answers. In parallel, a nightly examination of conscience, done honestly, acts as a small steel. Before bed, mentally review the day's decisions. What attitude seemed conformist, where there was an omission? What gesture could have been more charitable? And propose a concrete change for tomorrow. This exercise transforms intention into decision and creates a routine of conversion that, repeated, changes behavior. And what's more, transform compassion into a practical gesture at least once a week. It doesn't have to be large. It can be a visit to a neighbor who lives alone, a discreet help to someone in the community, or a phone call to someone who has suffered a loss. Service to others translates the message into real impact and combines consolation and steel. It consoles those who suffer and demands from us the dedication and sacrifice of time and comfort. These three practices, silence, examination, and charity, are examples of how the final message seeks not only to move, but also to produce tangible fruits in daily life, promoting a journey of transformation that is both internal and visible. By proposing these exercises, I'm not selling a foolproof formula. I'm pointing out paths of effective discipline that collaborate with the hidden truth of the call. Often, what seems subtle in words becomes forceful in routine. The mindset that forms from these small gestures is different. We move from the initial attraction of emotion to a responsible commitment, of decisions that no longer depend solely on the wind of circumstances, but on habits built with intention. Transformation in this sense is progressive and requires patience. We don't expect grand spectacles, but changes that are consolidated through daily repetition. At the same time, these practices function as tests. If the message consoles without producing change, perhaps we have absorbed only the surface. If it provokes restlessness that leads us to repair, reconcile, and love with concrete gestures, then something real is happening. There's also a community aspect that can't be overlooked. When families accept the call to spiritual vigilance, when groups begin to share prayer practices and promote small services for one another, the impact multiplies. The message ceases to be a mere individual account and becomes a matrix of decisions that reconfigure relationships, lifestyles, and priorities. This creates a ripple effect. Someone who decides to fast or dedicate time to silence may, inspired, invite a relative to talk, and from this conversation can emerge reconciliations, practical agreements, and a new family rhythm. The background to these transformations is often discreet, made up of table conversations, apologies offered, and habits changed for the greater good. This is where the hidden truth of the messages clearly reveals itself. It's not just about feeling good for a moment. It's about reorienting daily decisions that together alter trajectories. There are also psychological and moral consequences to consider. Spiritual vigilance, when properly understood, doesn't create permanent guilt or chronic anxiety. On the contrary, it helps establish healthy boundaries, build a responsible mindset, and promote choices that protect the common good. Deciding on simple practices is an exercise in freedom, not servitude. It frees us from automatism and places us before more conscious choices. Fasting, for example, can be an extreme gesture for some and a light one for others, but at any level, it serves as a test of priorities. Do I choose fleeting comforts or invest in something that strengthens my character and my commitment to others? The answer in practice impacts relationships, how we manage our time, and how we make decisions in crucial moments. However, as we apply all of this, we must recognize that the terrain is complex and not without pitfalls. The message it demands can also be misappropriated by leaders seeking control, by movements that confuse rigor with psychological violence, or by interpretations seeking spectacle. Discernment, therefore, is key, verifying whether the fruits are peace, humility, charity, and a real impact on lives, or whether they generate division, pride, and disorientation. Seeking guidance from trusted leaders, comparing it with scripture, and observing signs of spiritual maturity are practical steps to avoid falling for false signals. Prudence protects both the individual and the community, and this is part of the background of any serious revelation experience. Truth be told, there are reports of those who applied these practices and saw their lives change profoundly. There are also cases where the search for quick signs led to frustration. Understanding this difference is essential for a responsible and genuine response to the message. The seventh message, in particular, serves as a test of sincerity. It doesn't ask for empty words, but decisions that translate into habits. It doesn't promise a shortcut, but presents a path that demands repetition and fidelity. The real impact, therefore, is gradual, and the transformation sought is not just emotional, but practical, moral, and communal. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, examining how these practices intertwine with the call to inner conversion and the evidence of change we can observe in the lives of those around us. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when we speak of revelations and spiritual experiences, the beauty of the message can coexist with subtle pitfalls, and it is precisely in these subtleties that discernment becomes indispensable. Not every emotionally charged experience is proof of authenticity. Not every seemingly extraordinary sign has a salutary purpose. Hidden truth, when genuine, does not explode into a permanent spectacle nor feed vanity. It produces discreet and lasting fruits, peace that endures even in trials, humility that does not seek the spotlight, and charity that translates into concrete gestures. True signs always converge on peace, charity, and humility. This maxim should be the lens through which we evaluate any apparition, prophecy, or message that seeks to influence our spiritual journey and the community's decisions. Unfortunately, there are repeated patterns in reports of false guidance that deserve our attention. Leaders or movements that pressure followers into unquestioning obedience, demand secrets as proof of fidelity, or financially exploit those seeking solace are not signs of spiritual authority, but of manipulation. Likewise, prophecies that fuel permanent fear, promise exclusive privileges to a few, or incite division within families and communities should be viewed with caution. The practice of discernment requires us to observe not only the exalted language of the moment, but the long-term consequences. Does the experience bring people closer to love, reconciliation, and service? Or does it divide, isolate, and weaken them morally? This practical question is a good barometer. Discernment also involves a consultation with scripture and tradition, because an authentic message never contradicts the essence of the gospel. When the received word encourages prayer, humility, charity, and repentance, and when these words are echoed in sacred scripture and the sacramental practices that sustain Christian life, this reinforces its credibility. On the other hand, if revelation proposes theological deviations, suggests practices that deviate from the liturgy, or glorifies attitudes contrary to love for one's neighbor, it is time to raise alarm bells. Consulting texts, guides, and the wisdom of masters of faith helps to place each experience in its context and illuminate the gray areas where emotion can confuse. Furthermore, seeking guidance from trusted spiritual leaders, priests, recognized spiritual directors, people with exemplary lives, is a responsible step. These figures, when honest and humble, do not negate personal experience, but rather help frame it within criteria of spiritual maturity. They often ask, what are the visible fruits? Is there an increase in patience, charity, and humility? Is there coherence between words and actions? Is there scandal or edification? Questions like these are not intended to discredit miracles, but to protect the community from hasty decisions and leaders who confuse authority with control. Another practical form of discernment is observing time. Messages that remain coherent and continue to bear fruit over months and years tend to reveal more authenticity than phenomena that shine brightly for a day and then fade without leaving any signs of lasting transformation. Real impact is measured in perseverance, transformations that sustain spiritual life even when there is no longer public acclaim. This is the difference between an emotional moment and a conversion that reconfigures mindsets and decisions. Behind the scenes of these experiences, transparency is also healthy. Communities and leaders who encourage accountability, welcome questions, and promote public dialogue reduce the risk of authoritarianism. The spiritual world does not negate the need for healthy human structures, financial responsibility, clear processes for discernment, and spaces where doubts can be expressed without punishment. When revelations coexist with these elements, they create an environment less prone to abuse and more capable of bearing authentic fruit. it is equally necessary to consider personal motivations when faced with an apparition or message. Sometimes, what we desire to see can distort our interpretation. The search for immediate consolation can make us susceptible to easy promises. Therefore, the prayer of silence, consulting with those with experience, and comparing ourselves with signs of peace and humility are practices that safeguard the integrity of discernment. It is not about distrusting on principle, but about loving the truth responsibly, protecting both the individual and the community. It's also important to remember that error can clash with good. Certain misconceptions arise even among sincere people. Therefore, fraternal correction, delivered with charity, is part of the purification process. Mature communities don't expel critics with accusations, but rather promote dialogue that builds. Mature leaders don't seek captive followers, but rather people free to choose and grow. This community ethic is, in practice, a sign that the environment is conducive to authentic messages flourishing and false signals being perceived without violence. Prudence doesn't suppress wonder, it guides it. We can and should embrace experiences that touch the heart, but with open eyes and feet firmly planted on the ground of conscious decisions. The transformation promised by the messages is realized when there is a correspondence between what is said and what is done, between the comfort received and the choices that solidify a new mindset. The real impact is seen in attitudes that protect human dignity, restore relationships, and responsibly nurture hope. With that in mind, let's close with what these messages really promise and the final invitation. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And before concluding this part of the journey, I want to take you to a scene that will help you feel the weight and tenderness of these words together. Imagine yourself sitting in a small church, the air warm and the silence heavy as a blanket. Outside, life continues with its demands, bills, screens, distracting conversations. But inside this space, something different happens. A simple phrase whispered in the depths of a hill finds your ear, and suddenly, two distinct reactions arise within you at the same time. A relief that embraces and a restlessness that nudges. This is the experience of many who have received the seventh message, comfort that soothes old wounds and, simultaneously, a precise cut that reveals what needs to be changed, a hidden truth that insists on emerging. The promise is clear to those who sincerely accept the call. If these words enter your heart and are translated into concrete decisions, something will change in your journey. The transformation will not just be sentimental. It will be practical, formed by small, repeated habits that change mentality and behavior. Feel for a moment the impact of this idea. It's not an invitation to a spectacle, nor an empty promise of easy comfort. It's a call to reorder priorities, to make decisions that often upset, to choose the essential over the transient. The steel metaphor isn't cruelty, it's measurement, forging. Those who understand the pedagogy behind the words realize that true healing requires courage. Courage to admit mistakes, courage to ask for forgiveness, courage to reject shortcuts that numb the conscience. And when this happens, the comfort that came first transforms into solid, not ephemeral peace. The impact is felt in the little things, a more patient gaze, a reconciliation that takes time but happens, a routine that begins to include silence, prayer, and service as pillars. The journey of transformation is less a dramatic leap and more a series of choices made one day at a time, a daily forging that tempers the spirit. There is beauty in this demand, because the world usually offers only two extremes, emotional numbness or hopeless hardness, and what we see in the messages is a third path, tenderness that demands a response. The promise made to us does not eliminate pain, but it redeems it when we use it as a starting point for change. And this change, to be real, requires concrete signs in behavior. Less reactivity, more presence in relationships, decisions that defend the common good, even when they are inconvenient to the ego. The mindset that emerges when this call is heeded is one of service, responsibility, and inner freedom. It is not an instantaneous transformation. It is a slow process that, when followed, produces a lasting impact. The behind-the-scenes nature of this transformation is often unromantic. Nights of prayer without a clear answer, difficult conversations with family members who don't understand the new stance, discreet renunciations that no one sees, temptations that appear as old habits trying to return. But it's precisely in these behind-the-scenes moments that change is confirmed. The story of lasting conversions almost always includes this anonymous work: repeated decisions, emotional discipline, and a willingness to repair what was broken. And when the person persists, the fruits appear not as a spectacle, but as signs of coherence, greater serenity in the face of loss, actions that prioritize others, choosing practices that strengthen faith and community. There's also a community aspect that makes everything more real. When an individual changes, they bring with them possibilities for change in those around them. The seed planted within a family can generate a new rhythm, new conversations, and eventually reconciliations that previously seemed impossible. This multiplier effect is the social impact that messages can have when accepted responsibly. They're not just words that warm a heart. They're guidance that, when lived, provokes collective transformations. Each person's journey contributes to the health and vitality of the surrounding social fabric. And this is perhaps the most convincing practical proof that these revelations aren't just emotional. At the same time, we need to be honest about the potential cost. Transformation requires choices that can upset the environment, which can bring temporary conflicts and even resistance. It's natural for change to be shocking because it exposes old comfort zones. Therefore, the ethics of conversion must go hand in hand with charity. Well-intentioned changes, made with humility and respect, produce fewer painful ruptures and more opportunities for dialogue and reconciliation. The power of the message is not authoritarian. It is inviting and, when insisted upon, transforms by persuasion, not imposition. There is still a side to the revelations that requires caution. Not every person who claims to be touched is prepared to lead or guide others. Not every excellent interpretation facilitates collective maturation. Maturity in this context is measured by fruits: love, patience, selfless service. True spiritual leadership does not seek protagonism. It seeks the good of others. This simple criterion serves as a compass to separate genuine enthusiasm from false promises. Because true transformation always translates into a positive impact on others' lives. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, examining how, concretely, the seventh message can be read and applied without falling into extremes, so that comfort and steel work together to produce sustainable change. Let's look at it word by word, understand the images, and learn to translate each phrase into choices that truly shape character and community. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me in this conversation. It means this topic resonated with you. If you'd like me to continue bringing you word-by-word analysis and practical tools like these, subscribe. It's the simplest way for me to know it's worth delving deeper and preparing useful content for your journey. If this reflection touched you in any way, leave a like. It's a subtle gesture that shows the connection we created throughout the video. And write one of these phrases in the comments so I know you stuck with me until the end. I'm with you until the end. Or this message was for me. It will help me understand how this message reached your heart. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click it and stay with me there so we can continue unraveling word by word and putting everything into practice with courage and tenderness. Thank you for being here.